Have you ever noticed something strange? Two people can earn exactly the same amount of money, work similar jobs, live in the same city, and yet 10 years later, one of them is financially free, while the other is drowning in stress, debt, and frustration. Why? Most people think money is about math. Income, expenses, investments, savings. But what if I told you that money has much less to do with mathematics than most people believe? What if the real game is happening somewhere else, inside your mind? Because the biggest financial battles are not fought in bank accounts. They're fought in human psychology. And the people who understand this often build wealth much faster than people who simply work harder. In fact, some of the wealthiest people in the world understand something that most people never realize. Money is emotional. Money is psychological. And money often has very little to do with intelligence. That's why smart people go broke. That's why lottery winners lose millions. That's why some people become wealthy on average incomes while others struggle despite earning more. The question is, what do they understand that most people don't? Hello, I'm Victoria Hayes, and welcome to Nexoryth. If you're interested in understanding money, business, psychology, power, and the hidden systems shaping modern life, make sure to subscribe now. Because on this channel, we don't just talk about making money. We talk about understanding the forces that control how people think, spend, save, invest, and build their future. And I highly recommend staying until the end of this video, because the final lesson might completely change the way you look at money for the rest of your life. In fact, it may explain why some people spend decades chasing wealth without ever finding it. Today, we're going to explore the hidden psychology of money, not the financial side, the human side, the fears, the habits, the emotions. The invisible forces that quietly shape financial success and financial failure. And once you start seeing them, you'll never look at money the same way again. The first lie we believe about money. Let's start with one of the biggest financial lies ever created. A lie so common that most people never question it. The lie is simple. If I make more money, all my financial problems will disappear. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? In fact, most people spend years chasing higher salaries because they genuinely believe the next income level will finally make them feel secure. But here's something interesting. If you ask someone earning $30,000 a year how much money they need to feel comfortable, they'll usually say a higher number, maybe $50,000, maybe $60,000. Then they reach that number. And strangely, they often don't feel much different. Then the target moves again. Now they need $80,000, then $100,000, then $150,000, and the cycle continues. This is one of the strangest things about human psychology. People don't simply adapt to money, they adapt incredibly fast. What once felt like luxury eventually becomes normal. What once felt exciting eventually becomes expected. And what once felt like success eventually feels average. Psychologists call this adaptation, but in the real world, it creates a dangerous illusion. People spend their entire lives chasing a financial finish line that keeps moving further away. And because they never understand what's happening psychologically, they assume the problem must be their income. So they work harder, they work longer, they sacrifice more. But often, the real problem isn't the amount of money they earn. It's their relationship with money itself. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever noticed that some people feel rich with relatively modest incomes, while others feel broke despite earning impressive salaries? How is that possible? The answer has very little to do with mathematics and almost everything to do with psychology. Because money is not experienced objectively, it's experienced emotionally. Two people can have the exact same amount of money sitting in their bank accounts. One feels secure. The other feels terrified. One sleeps peacefully. The other constantly worries. The number is identical. The psychology is different. and psychology almost always wins. This is why some people become trapped in what I call the more mentality. They believe happiness exists one purchase away, one promotion away, one investment away, one salary increase away. But every time they arrive, the satisfaction disappears faster than expected. Then they start chasing the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, until years pass, sometimes decades, and they realize they spent most of their lives pursuing financial comfort without ever actually feeling comfortable. Now, don't misunderstand me. Making more money absolutely matters. Financial growth matters. Building wealth matters. Improving your life matters. But if your psychology remains unchanged, more money often magnifies existing behaviors rather than solving them. Someone who spends emotionally with little money often spends emotionally with more money. Someone who constantly compares themselves to others with little money usually continues doing it with more money. Someone who feels financially insecure often carries that insecurity into every new income level. That's why some millionaires still feel poor, and some ordinary people feel wealthy. The difference isn't always found in the bank account. Sometimes it's found in the mind. And this is where things become really interesting. Because most financial advice focuses on numbers, budgets, investments, income, savings. Those things matter. But underneath all of them sits something far more powerful: human behavior. Because every financial decision starts in the mind before it ever reaches a wallet. Every purchase, every investment, every risk, every opportunity, every financial mistake. It all begins with psychology. And once you understand that, you stop asking only, how can I make more money? And you start asking a much more powerful question. What is money doing to the way I think? Because that question changes everything. And it leads us directly into the next hidden force that quietly controls almost every financial decision people make, without realizing it. The invisible force behind every purchase. Let me ask you a simple question. Have you ever bought something and then wondered later why you bought it in the first place? Maybe it was a new phone, a watch, a car, an expensive piece of clothing, a subscription you barely use, or maybe something even smaller. At the time, it felt important, necessary, almost urgent. But a few weeks later, the excitement disappeared, and suddenly the purchase didn't seem nearly as valuable as it did before. If that has ever happened to you, don't worry. It doesn't mean you're bad with money. It means you're human. Because one of the most powerful forces in finance isn't logic, it's emotion. And most people dramatically underestimate how much emotion influences their financial decisions. We like to think we're rational. We like to think we carefully analyze our purchases. But the truth is often very different. In reality, human beings are emotional creatures that occasionally use logic to justify emotional decisions. And marketers understand this better than almost anyone. Think about advertisements for a moment. Companies rarely sell products, they sell feelings. A luxury watch isn't sold as a device that tells time, it's sold as success. A sports car isn't sold as transportation, it's sold as status. A designer brand isn't sold as fabric, it's sold as identity. The product is often secondary. The emotion is the real product. And once you start seeing this, you realize modern economies run heavily on psychology. People aren't always buying things because they need them. They're buying stories. They're buying feelings. They're buying versions of themselves. And that's where money becomes fascinating, because every purchase secretly answers a question. The question is, who do I want to be? Most people never think about it this way, but it's happening constantly. A person buys luxury items because they want to feel successful. Another person buys expensive technology because they want to feel ahead. Another spends heavily on experiences because they want to feel alive. Another saves aggressively because they want to feel safe. Different behaviors, different spending habits, different financial outcomes. But underneath them all, the same psychology: emotion. Now, here's where things become dangerous, because emotions are temporary and financial consequences are often permanent. A feeling might last a day. A debt payment might last 5 years. A moment of excitement might last 10 minutes. A financial mistake might follow someone for a decade. That's why emotional spending is one of the most expensive habits people develop, and modern society constantly encourages it. Everywhere you look, someone is trying to make you feel something: fear, envy, excitement, urgency, desire. Because once emotion becomes strong enough, logic becomes weaker, and that's exactly when people spend. Social media made this even more powerful. For most of human history, people compared themselves to their neighbors. Today, people compare themselves to celebrities, influencers, millionaires, athletes, entrepreneurs, people they don't even know. And the human brain struggles to handle this, because comparison creates dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction creates spending. Someone sees a luxury lifestyle online. Suddenly their own life feels smaller. Someone sees a beautiful apartment. Suddenly their own apartment feels disappointing. Someone sees a successful entrepreneur. Suddenly they feel behind. The problem isn't the image itself. The problem is what happens emotionally afterward. Because money decisions made from insecurity are often terrible decisions. And this is something wealthy people eventually learn. Many purchases don't improve life nearly as much as people expect. The excitement fades. The novelty disappears. The lifestyle becomes normal. And then the brain starts searching for the next thing, the next upgrade, the next purchase, the next financial goal. And suddenly, life becomes an endless cycle of chasing satisfaction. But here's the interesting part. The people who build long-term wealth often learn how to separate emotion from action. Not completely. That's impossible. They're human too. But they learn to pause, to think, to ask questions. Questions like, do I actually want this? Or am I trying to solve an emotional problem with money? Because those are very different things, and many financial mistakes happen when people confuse them. Sometimes people don't need a new purchase. They need confidence. Sometimes they don't need a luxury upgrade. They need patience. Sometimes they don't need more money. They need more clarity. And once you start understanding this, money stops being just a financial subject. It becomes a psychological subject, because every dollar you spend tells a story, not only about what you bought, but about what you believed, what you feared, what you desired, and what you thought would make you happy. The question is, how many of those beliefs actually belong to you, and how many were quietly placed there by the world around you? Because the answer to that question may explain far more about your financial life than your income ever could. Why smart people still make terrible money decisions. Here's something that surprises a lot of people. Intelligence and financial success are not the same thing. In fact, some of the smartest people you'll ever meet struggle financially, and some people with average intelligence build enormous wealth. At first, that doesn't make sense. We naturally assume smarter people should make better financial decisions, but reality doesn't always work that way. Because money isn't an IQ test, it's a behavior test. And behavior is often driven by emotion rather than intelligence. Think about some of the smartest people you've ever known. Maybe they were brilliant at school. Maybe they had advanced degrees. Maybe they could solve complex problems that most people couldn't even understand. And yet, some of them still lived paycheck to paycheck. Some accumulated debt. Some made terrible investments. Some constantly struggled with money. Why? Because knowing something and doing something are completely different skills. A person can understand nutrition and still eat unhealthy food. A person can understand exercise and still avoid the gym. A person can understand money and still make poor financial decisions. Knowledge alone doesn't guarantee action, and that's one of the most important lessons in psychology. Now, here's where things become really interesting. Most bad financial decisions don't happen because people lack information. They happen because emotions temporarily overpower information. A person knows they shouldn't buy something. They buy it anyway. A person knows they should save money. They spend it anyway. A person knows an investment is risky. They invest anyway. Why? Because emotion often speaks louder than logic, especially when fear or excitement enters the conversation. Let's talk about fear first. Fear is one of the most powerful financial forces in the world. People fear being left behind. They fear missing opportunities. They fear looking unsuccessful. They fear uncertainty. And fear causes people to make decisions they normally wouldn't make. Think about financial bubbles throughout history. Stocks, housing, cryptocurrencies, different assets, same psychology. People see others making money. Excitement spreads. Fear of missing out grows. Suddenly, logic leaves the room, and people start chasing opportunities they barely understand. Not because they're stupid, because they're human. The same thing happens in reverse. When markets fall, people panic. Fear takes control, and they often sell at exactly the wrong moment. Again, not because they lack intelligence, because emotions are driving the decision. This is why psychology is often more important than knowledge, because knowledge tells you what to do. Psychology determines whether you'll actually do it. Now let's talk about something even more dangerous: ego. Because ego destroys more wealth than most people realize. Many people don't lose money because they were uninformed. They lose money because they were overconfident. They become convinced they're smarter than the market, smarter than everyone else, smarter than reality itself. And that's usually when mistakes become expensive. One of the strange things about success is that it can create dangerous confidence. A person wins a few times, makes a few good decisions, earns some money, and suddenly they begin believing every future decision will also be correct. That's when risk starts increasing, and often that's when trouble begins. The most financially successful people are often not the most confident people. They're usually the most disciplined. They understand something important. Being right occasionally is not enough. Protecting yourself from being wrong is just as important. And that mindset changes everything. Now, let's look at another psychological trap: instant gratification. Modern society trains people to expect immediate results: instant delivery, instant entertainment, instant communication, instant approval. Everything arrives quickly. Except wealth. Wealth is usually slow, painfully slow. And that's why many people struggle with it. Because building wealth often requires doing things that feel unrewarding in the short term. Saving money doesn't always feel exciting. Investing doesn't always feel exciting. Patience doesn't always feel exciting. But over time, those boring behaviors often create extraordinary results. Meanwhile, people chasing excitement often create financial chaos. And that's where intelligence becomes irrelevant. Because the challenge isn't understanding what works. The challenge is staying consistent long enough to benefit from it. Now, let me tell you something I've noticed. The people who improve their financial lives usually experience a shift. At some point, they stop asking, "How can I get rich quickly?" and start asking, "How can I make better decisions repeatedly?" That's a completely different question, and it produces completely different outcomes. Because wealth is rarely built by one brilliant decision. It's usually built by thousands of small decisions made consistently over time. The decision to save, the decision to wait, the decision to avoid unnecessary debt, the decision to invest, the decision to learn, the decision to think long term. None of those decisions look exciting individually, but together they become powerful. And maybe that's the biggest misunderstanding people have about money. They think financial success belongs to the smartest people, but very often it belongs to the people who manage their emotions best, the people who remain calm when others panic, the people who remain patient when others rush, the people who remain disciplined when others become distracted. Because at the end of the day, money is not only about what you know, it's about what you do. And what you do is usually determined by how well you understand yourself. Which brings us to an even bigger question. If psychology shapes so many financial decisions, then what separates people who build wealth from people who spend their entire lives chasing it? That's exactly what we're going to explore next. The wealth secret nobody teaches. Let me tell you something that took me years to understand. Most people think wealthy individuals have access to secret information, secret investments, secret opportunities, secret strategies. And yes, sometimes they do, but that's not what creates the biggest difference. The biggest difference is much simpler. Wealthy people often see money differently, not because they're smarter, not because they're luckier, but because they've trained themselves to think differently. Let me explain. Imagine two people receive the exact same amount of money. The first person immediately thinks, what can I buy with this? The second person asks, how can I make this grow? The amount of money is identical. The mindset is completely different. And over time, that difference becomes enormous. Because every financial decision moves your future in one of two directions, toward consumption or toward ownership. Most people spend their lives becoming consumers. They consume products, consume entertainment, consume trends, consume lifestyles, consume status. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying life. That's not the problem. The problem is when consumption becomes the entire strategy. Because consumers exchange money for temporary satisfaction. Owners exchange money for future opportunity. And that single distinction changes everything. Think about it. A consumer asks, how much does it cost? An owner asks, what does it produce? A consumer sees a paycheck as spending power. An owner sees a paycheck as fuel. A consumer thinks about this month. An owner thinks about the next decade. And this is why wealth often appears invisible at first, because the habits that build it don't look impressive. They're actually quite boring. Saving, investing, waiting, learning, repeating. Most people don't become poor because of one catastrophic decision. They become poor because of thousands of small decisions that prioritize today over tomorrow. And most people don't become wealthy because of one brilliant investment. They become wealthy because of thousands of small decisions that prioritize tomorrow without completely sacrificing today. That's the secret. And unfortunately, it's not very exciting, which is exactly why so many people ignore it. Modern culture rewards excitement, fast results, big wins, instant success. But wealth rarely grows that way. Real wealth often grows quietly, while nobody is paying attention. And that's why many people misunderstand wealthy individuals. They see the result, the house, the investments, the lifestyle, the freedom. But they don't see the years of discipline that happened beforehand. They don't see the decisions nobody applauded, the sacrifices nobody noticed, the patience nobody celebrated. Because discipline isn't attractive on social media. Luxury is. And that creates another psychological trap. People begin chasing the appearance of wealth before building actual wealth. They buy expensive symbols of success, but ignore the behaviors that create success. And eventually, they end up looking wealthy without becoming wealthy. That's one of the most expensive mistakes modern society encourages. Now, here's something even more important. The wealthiest people are often obsessed with time. Not money, time. Because eventually they realize something profound. Money can return. Time never does. That's why financially successful people often ask different questions. Instead of asking, how can I make more money? They ask, how can I create more freedom? Because freedom is the real goal. Not numbers, not status, not attention. Freedom. The freedom to choose. The freedom to leave a bad situation. The freedom to say no. The freedom to spend time with people you care about. The freedom to build a life intentionally instead of reacting to circumstances. And once you understand that, your entire relationship with money begins to change. Money stops being the destination. It becomes a tool that can buy options, a tool that can reduce pressure, a tool that can create opportunities, a tool that can protect your future. And maybe that's the hidden psychology of wealth. People think wealthy individuals are chasing money, but many of them are actually chasing control over their own lives. Money is simply one of the vehicles they use to get there. Now, here's the irony. The more desperately people chase money, the harder it often becomes to think clearly about it. Fear enters, greed enters, comparison enters, and those emotions create bad decisions. But when people focus on building value, building skills, building patience, building discipline, money often becomes a byproduct. Not immediately, not magically, but gradually. And that's where the real advantage appears. Because while most people are searching for shortcuts, a small group is quietly building foundations. And foundations last much longer than shortcuts. Maybe that's why financial success looks mysterious from the outside. People see the outcome, but they miss the psychology behind it. The habits, the patience, the emotional control, the ability to think long-term in a world obsessed with immediate gratification. And perhaps that's the greatest wealth lesson nobody teaches. The biggest financial battle is rarely happening in your bank account. It's happening in your mind. Because before wealth becomes a financial result, it usually starts as a psychological shift. A shift in how you think, how you decide, how you react, and most importantly, how you see the future. And once that shift happens, everything else begins to change. So let's step back for a moment. We've talked about something most people never think about deeply. Not money itself, but the psychology behind it. Because if there's one idea I hope you take away from this video, it's this. Money is rarely just about money. It's about fear. It's about desire. It's about status. It's about security. It's about identity. And most of the financial decisions people make throughout their lives are influenced by those emotions far more than they realize. That's why two people can earn the same income and end up with completely different futures. That's why intelligent people can make terrible financial decisions. That's why some people spend their entire lives chasing wealth without ever feeling wealthy. And that's why understanding yourself may be more important than understanding money. Because at the end of the day, money doesn't change who you are. It often reveals who you already are. If you're impatient with little money, more money usually won't make you patient. If you're constantly comparing yourself to others, more money usually won't stop the comparison. If you're chasing validation, there will never be enough money to satisfy it. That's why the real goal isn't becoming rich. The real goal is developing a healthy relationship with money. A relationship where money becomes a tool, not a source of identity. A relationship where financial decisions are guided by intention instead of emotion. A relationship where you're building freedom instead of appearances. Because the truth is, many people spend years trying to look wealthy. Very few spend years trying to become free. And freedom is what actually matters. The freedom to make choices, the freedom to take opportunities, the freedom to spend your time the way you want, the freedom to build a life that reflects your values rather than society's expectations. And maybe that's the hidden psychology of money. The people who master money are often the people who first learn to master themselves. They learn patience, they learn discipline, they learn emotional control. They learn how to think long-term in a world that constantly encourages short-term thinking. And over time, those psychological advantages become financial advantages. Not overnight, not magically, but consistently. So the next time you make a financial decision, don't just ask, can I afford this? Ask something deeper. Ask, why do I want this? Because the answer to that question may tell you more about your future than any investment ever could. And maybe that's where real financial intelligence begins. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to Nexoryth for more content about money, psychology, business, power, and the hidden systems shaping modern life. And before you leave, I want to ask you one question. What do you think influences people's financial decisions more? Logic or emotion? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, keep thinking differently.